So I have a series of questions I want to start out asking you today, and it requires some participation on your part. And so if you think that the question applies to you, please raise your hand. So how many of you would die for a family member? How many of you would die for a friend? Some of you are maybe reconsidering your friends list quick, perhaps. How many of you would die for a stranger? Ooh. How many of you would die for an enemy? Okay, a couple of hands raised. Congratulations on that, because I don't even think I would have the gumption to do that. But today we are going to continue on in our series called May the Faith Be With You, and this is just a brief look at I guess what we'll call an intersection of pop culture and faith. And so we've been looking at the Star Wars series as well as some of the biblical characters and themes that have gone on without it. And so if you are brand new today, I'll give you just a very brief recap of each one of the segments. So in week one, we took a look at the cosmology of Star Wars and invited us to think about our own faith and what it means to live in the supernatural. In week two, we looked at the rise of heroes and this call that God gives us to go out on an adventure of our own, and that the path of faith is not always an easy one, but it's a heroic one. And last week, then, we looked at what we called beware of the dark side, and the fact that temptation and sin can come in to our lives, and we began to look at some of the consequences of that, and we looked specifically at the character of Anakin Skywalker, and then also went back and looked at the biblical character of Adam. And so this week we are going to continue to move forward with this series, and we're going to continue to explore part of that storyline with Anakin and Adam, but now we're going to add a couple more characters, and we're going to go back and bring in Luke Skywalker as well as the person of Jesus Christ. So last week I left you with a slide. Oops, I went the wrong way. Apparently the graduates want to be congratulated again. It's not working for me, Dale. There we go. So I left you with this slide, and one of the things in Star Wars that we're left with, we watched a small video clip of Anakin basically turning to the dark side, right? Basically casting aside everything that he loved and cared for, just in an essence to gain more power. But yet one of the things that happens is that throughout the first three movies, there's this prophecy, this idea that he is the chosen one, that he will bring balance to the Force. And we might say then that he has indeed done that as he moves to the dark side, he essentially extinguishes the overwhelming power on the light side and moves it back to the middle. But obviously his story isn't done, and it continues into the original series then. We also went and looked at the story in Genesis of the fall of man, or of humanity, and we looked specifically at the prophecy that's found in chapter 3 of Genesis, this idea that God comes into the garden and he connects with Adam and he says, look, because you've done this, there's going to be some consequences, but here's the deal. I'm going to already begin to make a way to make things right. Okay, and we talked about verse 3:14, where the serpent will bite the heel of the seed of Adam and Eve, and yet that seed of Adam and Eve will crush the head of the serpent, right? And so that's what that verse speaks of. So as we go on today, then, let's begin looking at our next hero, who just happens to be Anakin's son, and that is the person of Luke Skywalker. And we find Luke, again, in many of the same places and doing the same things that his father's done. He's on this barren, remote planet. He's living kind of this meager existence, if you will. He's obviously gifted in the skills that he has, and yet they've also made him kind of arrogant. And he also has this desire to just go off and have this grand adventure, if you will. And so as we find him, we then learn that he is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker, and it creates this whole different dynamic then, because one of the things Luke must do in order to complete his training as a Jedi is to go and confront his father, right? And we're led to believe that really the only way that this confrontation ends is if Luke destroys his father. But Luke just has it in his heart that he just can't do it. There's just something there that sets him against that idea. Now, within the movies, there's also a couple of beautiful pictures of Luke having to deal with his own temptation. And so there's a movie clip that I had wanted to show you, but we just didn't have enough time, where Luke goes into this cave when he's training with Yoda, and he faces this phantasm that appears to be Darth Vader, and they get into combat, and as he basically defeats this visage of his father, the helmet explodes and opens up, and rather than seeing Anakin's face in there, he sees his own. And he realizes that he must be careful, or he'll end up taking the exact same path that his father has gone down. Okay? And so we move then into the end of the series, and we find essentially this climactic battle between Luke and his father, and also the Emperor, what we might consider Satan himself, the ultimate evil within the entire story. And it's interesting how Luke wants to give in to the temptation, wants to give in to his anger to go and defeat and destroy his father, and yet he gets his father to a point where he beats him down on the ground and he cuts off his hand, right? If you remember that part, and all of a sudden, what does Luke do? He immediately stops because he too has had that same hand cut off. And I believe he just reimagines that picture of him in the cave, realizing that if he takes the next step forward, if he strikes down his father, he will go down the exact same path. And what does he do? He closes down and discards his weapon and says, "No more. I'm not going to turn. I'm not going in to give in to the temptation. I'm not going to let my emotions run rampant and do what it is you, the Emperor, want me to do." As a result, then, the Emperor decides that he will destroy Luke because he can't be turned. He won't come to his side. And again, we have all the crazy Force lightning coming down. And in the midst of that, Vader picks up the Emperor and throws him down the shaft. And we might say that that moment, that there's an atonement that happens, that somehow Vader finds what good spark of, or the spark of goodness that's left in him, this little spark that Luke sensed in him, and it changes the whole story. Okay? And so in many ways, we might, and again, this example only goes so far, so don't take this directly, but we might say in many ways that Luke is an example of Christ, right? That he provides a way for the atonement of his father to happen. Okay? So, if you have your Bibles handy, I invite you to open up to Romans chapter 5. In the New Testament, I'm actually using a personal Bible, and I'm using a New King James, so it will be a little bit different than your Pew Bible, but encourage you to turn to chapter 5, and let's look at verses 6 through 11. So Paul says this to his audience: "For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him. For if when we were enemies we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, such more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. All right? So, friends, again, most of us, if we've grown up in the church, we know the story of Jesus Christ, right? The fact that God himself comes down incarnate in human flesh to be amongst humanity. And he grows up a very meager and what we would probably consider a poor life in many respects. He's the son of a carpenter in this small little remote village. In fact, if you go back to the scriptures, one of the verses says, you know what, can anything good come out of that little town that Jesus grew up in? You know? And yet, out of this little town of Nazareth comes Jesus Christ. And when he comes of age, right after his baptism, what happens? He goes to the wilderness, right? And immediately he too, just like Adam, has to face a series of trials and temptations that come before him. And Satan himself is there offering him all of these different things. If you will but bow down to me, or why don't you just do this and you can have the food that you need. And time again, Christ replies, no, it is written, and he passes the test. And so where Adam fails, Christ has succeeded. All right? And so then in the goodness of time, or in the fullness of time, as Paul says, Christ comes and he dies for us. And so again, friends, we might say now that the prophecy has been fulfilled, right? The serpent bites his heel. Through his resurrection and his ascension, Jesus crushes the head of the serpent. But he also did something for us. And that is when he died and he spilled his blood, that blood provided the atoning sacrifice needed for us to be reconciled to God the Father. Okay? And so one of the things we talked about last week was the fact that when Adam moved into temptation, basically everything broke, right? The relationship between man and God broke, and basically creation broke as well. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about atonement because it's really an important factor for us to understand, okay? And so I'd like you to kind of think and think on this process that I have up there in line 1, and it says, sin takes life, right? We've talked about this over and over again, that the wages of sin is death. Basically, anytime sin enters in, it begins to kill stuff. The blood then covers sin, and the reason it does that is because there's life in the blood. Okay? And so if we go back to Leviticus chapter 17, we find that God mandates then that this is the way that people are to atone for their sin, because right now there's no other way. And often this is really confusing to us because we live in a period of time and a culture so far removed from what the ancient Hebrews did that the thought of bringing a lamb in here and sacrificing it on the altar, we can't even fathom what that would look like. But this is where it comes from. And this was the command of God to say, look, if you want your sin forgiven, you have to sacrifice these animals and do these rituals, and your sin will be forgiven. Now, as we move forward and as Jesus enters in, Hebrews chapter 8 and 9, and I would encourage you to read these because they're a beautiful depiction of Jesus being that sacrificial lamb, that spotless, blameless lamb that comes in and provides the blood necessary for our atonement of sin. But here's the thing, friends. Jesus doesn't have to die over and over. Because he's innocent, because he never gave in to the temptation, because he is sinless, his blood is the perfect, the ultimate sacrifice for us. And because of that sacrifice on the cross, because our Savior's blood was spilled, we then are restored to correct and right relationship. Our sin is covered by the blood. All right? And this is very important for us to remember as we go forward.
Nothing can stop that now. Just for once, let me look on you with my own eyes. Go, my son. Leave me.
No, you're coming with me. I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have. Look. You're right. You're right about me. Tell your sister. You're right.
Father. I won't leave you.
And so obviously a scene from Return of the Jedi, and I think that that's a very symbolic scene of this idea of atonement and redemption that we get, right? So at the end of Return of the Sith, ironically, the two names kind of match, we see the mask come down over Vader, right? And we all of a sudden see the red light flash in his eyes. And now, because of the sacrifice of his son, his mask, for the first time in much of his adult life, gets peeled back, and he's able to look on his son, on the thing that he loves, the one, or basically the one of two things he has left in this universe to love. And he thanks his son for the sacrifice, for not being willing to give up on him, and to still be willing to see the goodness in us. And friends, I would say Jesus has done the exact same thing, that he remembers what it was like to have made us in the image of himself, and then said, "It is good." And then he was not willing to give up on us, and therefore he was willing to go to the cross even though he had done absolutely nothing wrong, so that he could come back and say, "I love you this much, and I'm here to save you from the destruction that you're bent on." And so, friends, we find the epitome of evil, essentially. One of the greatest villains of all time peel his mask back, and what do we find? Nothing but a broken down old man. And friends, again, we continue to talk about the fact that the wages of sin is death. And any time sin enters in, it causes destruction. And so, friends, let us be thankful then that Jesus was willing to offer that sacrifice for us, that we could live. So, friends, I want us to go through and look at the rest of chapter 5 this morning. Yeah, you're going to have to move one. And so let's read Romans 5:12 through 21. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. But the free gift is not like the offense. For if by one man's offense many died, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. In the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For the judgment which came and the offense that resulted in condemnation. But the free gift which came from many offenses resulted in justification. For if by one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in the life through the one, Jesus Christ. Therefore, as though one man's offense judgment came to all men, resulting in condemnation, even so through one man's righteous act, the free gift came to all men, resulting in the justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many were made righteous. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. So that as the sin reigned in death, even so grace might reign through righteousness and eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So friend, that's kind of a tongue twister in terms of the way Paul works through that. That's kind of the way he writes the book of Romans. But essentially, it's a beautiful example of something that we might call the second Adam. This idea that, again, Jesus came to be what Adam failed to become or failed to be. That he was the perfect example of what humanity should look like. And because he was also God, his sacrifice could restore us to the way it was and also give us the gift of redemption and the hope for eternal life. So friends, I'm going to leave you with that today. And I'm going to invite you, if I can get the next slide, but basically the next slide is our action step. And so friends, I want you to consider the sacrifice that has been made for you. That gift of Jesus' blood, that ability to be reconciled and redeemed in Jesus Christ, and to think about the gift and the hope that we have of eternal life with Jesus Christ. Amen.